What's up, heathens? How ya doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today we're going to be hearing from a somewhat new apologist channel here on YouTube. I'm so happy to see new people getting involved in standing up and using their voice, even if it's for their Christian point of view. Today, though, he's going to be explaining to all of us ignorant atheists out here what atheism actually means.
But theism is universally understood as the belief that the proposition God exists is true. This means that theism is an inherently propositional position. And what follows from that is that anything that is meant to stand in contradistinction to theism must similarly be a propositional position. This means that if we want to juxtapose atheism with theism, then atheism has to be understood as a belief that the proposition God does not exist is true.
So theism is technically defined as a belief in a god or gods or some kind of supernatural deity. So the opposite of that would be not believing in a god or gods or supernatural deity. So I feel like you're just playing around with definitions here and you're convoluting the conversation. Well, if y'all want to know why this apologist is wrong on what atheism is, then please stay tuned. Alright, so before we begin the video today, I know that I've laid this out several times before in my videos, but I just want to preface this video by saying that atheism is a non-belief or lack of belief in a god or gods or a supernatural deity of some kind. That's all that it is, at least in the colloquial sense. There are multiple definitions for atheism, and it depends on the context in which you are speaking in as to what you could possibly mean. But I feel like the more important thing is to understand how a person uses a label so that the conversation can continue, and not get wrapped up in these definition fallacies where you're just throwing dictionaries at each other. Personally, I feel that the agnostic, Gnostic, theism, atheism distinctions are very useful so that I can fully describe my position and call myself an agnostic atheist. That means that I don't know whether or not a God exists, but I also don't believe in any God or gods. Gnostic atheists would claim that God definitely doesn't exist. And I feel like that position is just as tenable as saying that God definitely does exist. And there are plenty of atheists out there that definitely go the harder atheist route or the Gnostic route, and that's perfectly fine. I don't feel like I have enough evidence to say that God doesn't exist whatsoever. I live my life as though God doesn't exist, and I don't believe a God to exist. Until you can provide me with the evidence that definitely suggests that God does exist or that he absolutely cannot exist, then I'm going to remain in the agnostic category as far as what I know. But as to what I believe, I don't believe a God does exist. But believing in something is different than absolutely knowing something. So agnostic and Gnostic deal with knowledge. What do you know? And then theism and atheism deal in what you believe, specifically about the God question. All right, now that we got all of that out of the way, let's see what this guy has for us.
Welcome to Catalyzing Faith, where we seek to be a catalyst for your faith so that you can be a catalyst in the world around you. This series is called Catalyzing Questions, where we seek to answer some of the common questions or objections that you might find as you dive deeper into apologetics. And today, we are answering the question of, what is atheism?
Now, I have to applaud you for your opening here. You have a very solid and structured video all the way throughout. You start out by welcoming your viewer and you let them know what your purpose is right up front. And I think that most people on this platform should follow these kinds of things when structuring their YouTube videos. Greet the audience, let them feel welcomed into your video, and then also tell them what you are about in a very short sentence. That's why I have changed my structure at the very beginning to be very welcoming with the what's up, heathens? How y'all doing? That's always been kind of a thing. But then I've added the part that tells you what I'm here to do, to critically analyze apologist claims, give you good arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. And that's exactly what he's doing here. And I have to stop for a second because I don't usually see this in apologist videos here on YouTube. And I just have to applaud you, Catalyzing Faith, for structuring your YouTube video in such a pleasing way.
All right, I'll address this up front. I get that this may seem like a weird question to address in an apologetics series on questions regarding the Christian faith. But if you've spent any time at all on the internet engaging with atheists, chances are you've heard someone respond with something to the effect of, whoa, I'm not saying that God doesn't exist. I'm just saying that I lack a belief in God. Or maybe they'll come out and say, hey, atheism isn't a belief. Atheism is just a lack of belief. I find that these sort of responses tend to catch Christians off guard.
Well, that's probably because you have a lot of apologists out there that specifically push the philosophical version of atheism that exists on that Stanford site. You have a lot of non-philosophers wanting to force people to use a philosophical, academic definition. You have that all over the place. Now, if we're going to be talking about in a colloquial sense, what does atheism mean? You can consult any kind of dictionary and it will tell you the exact same thing I'm about to tell you. Now, again, dictionaries are descriptive, not prescriptive. So whatever definition for a word that exists now, it could definitely change in the future with how people use it. And that's going to be very important in this video. Now, if you look on Google and just type in define atheism, you will get disbelief or lack of belief in the existence of gods or gods. So this is definitely the definition of atheism, but it's not the only definition. And I'm not trying to strictly define atheism as that, because there are definitely atheists out there that take the more philosophical version of the definition, and that's perfectly fine. But you also cannot come at atheists trying to use a strict definition of atheism. And like I said in my intro, it's more important to understand what the person means when they use a label than it is to squabble over definitions. My advice to his audience, if any of them might be watching, or others out there, is that it's more important to understand whether or not somebody believes in a God or just simply doesn't believe in a God, or is positively asserting that no gods exist. It's important to understand those things about a person rather than squabble over how they're using a certain word.
So what's going on here? Well, it surprises the Christians for a pretty good reason, because the traditional understanding of atheism, and that is the understanding of atheism that most philosophers, including atheist philosophers, accept, is that atheism is a belief that the proposition God does not exist is true.
What I think that he's trying to get at here is a hard definition of atheism, meaning a Gnostic definition, which is the one that's contained in that Stanford dictionary kind of definition for philosophy, to be used in a more academic setting, I guess, at Stanford. But also, what you're doing here is appealing to tradition and a dictionary fallacy, because I don't care what the traditional word means, or in tradition what this word means. I care about what the word means now. And since dictionaries are descriptive and not prescriptive, I would say that the current dictionary definition is definitely descriptive of how we're using the word atheism now. But I mean, even if you just break down the word into its individual parts, a meaning not, and theism meaning a belief in God or gods, it literally means not a belief in gods. So you strictly using atheism in this very academically philosophical sense in just normal everyday colloquial conversation is kind of ridiculous. And it feels like you're trying to force atheists out there to make some kind of positive assertion that no gods exist. But all you're doing right here is you're just twisting around the definitions of words in order to make them work for you, so that you kind of have this upper hand in the conversation. Again, I'll stress it's more important to understand what a person does believe and doesn't believe than it is to squabble over labels.
It's only been in recent years that some popular level atheists have started making this lack of belief definition prominent. But rest assured that insofar as the professional philosophers dealing with the philosophy of religion goes, most of them still accept the definition that atheism is a belief that God does not exist.
Okay. That's fine for them. Are we in a professional academic setting? Are we writing papers in a academic philosophical context? No, we're not. But even so, in an academic paper, you can define what you mean by a certain word at the very beginning. And as long as your paper is consistent in using that particular meaning for that word throughout the entire paper, it should be fine. In fact, a study was done where multiple different definitions of atheism were found in academic publications. So limiting the definition of atheism to just a single definition that you found on a single academic website and calling it some kind of universal traditional kind of meaning and insisting that everybody sticks with that meaning kind of makes you look like an asshole. Now, I'm fairly certain that this guy would probably label what most people consider atheism to be actually be agnosticism. And I'm not going to shit on the agnostic label per se, because the agnostic label has become a thing. Agnosticism has become a belief position. Even though I disagree with the agnostic label as far as an isolated use of the label, because for me, just saying I'm agnostic doesn't really answer what you're agnostic about. The insinuation that has developed over recent years is that agnostic primarily pertains to belief in God. But you can be agnostic on a whole range of things. I'm agnostic as to whether or not my packages will come in next week. I have a fairly high confidence that they will, but ultimately I don't know. So I'm agnostic about Amazon Prime's delivery service. All right, well, let's get back to catalyzing faith, gatekeeping the atheist community.
So what is atheism? The answer kind of depends on what we want the word to do. Now, in general, the word atheism is meant to stand in contradistinction to theism. But theism is universally understood as the belief that the proposition God exists is true. This means that theism is an inherently propositional position. And what follows from that is that anything that is meant to stand in contradistinction to theism must similarly be a propositional position. This means that if we want to juxtapose atheism with theism, then atheism has to be understood as a belief that the proposition God does not exist is true.
Then I'm kind of curious there, catalyzing faith. What label would you place on someone just not believing that God exists? What would you call that person? Because at this point, I really don't know what in the fuck you would call that person. I mean, I would label that person that doesn't believe in God an atheist. Of course, if you wanted to be more specific, there are plenty of people groups out there that don't believe in the Yahweh version of God, so they are not Christian. I am not Christian, but I am also not a theist. So what would you call not a theist? Let's see. We've got a handy little prefix here. It's just an A. That means not. And then atheist. So not theist. Atheist. Holy shit, we just invented a word. Oh, wait, no, that's exactly what this whole entire video is about. How atheism or atheist doesn't mean not believing in a God.
Because otherwise we're not comparing the same thing. Let's think about it.
Who says that atheism is trying to compare, same things here? I don't accept the proposition that atheism has to be propositional just because theism is propositional. Again, I want to harp on this whole idea of what would you call someone that does not accept that proposition? If I just don't accept that proposition, what would you label me? I'd love to know.
If atheism is a mere lack of belief, then all we're doing is describing the contents of someone's psychological state. We're not really addressing the truth or falsehood of any sort of claim. So atheism then doesn't become a true or false kind of thing in the way theism is.
Well, yeah, I would say atheism doesn't speak to any kind of truth as to whether or not God exists. Theism and atheism inherently only speak to the beliefs of a person. Like if someone is a theist, they believe in God. If someone is an atheist, they don't believe in God. What you're trying to do is you're trying to turn theism into this absolute question of whether or not God exists, instead of somebody just simply believing that a God exists. You see, theism, as it's defined, by the way, is just somebody that believes in a god or gods. That speaks nothing to the truth of the proposition of whether or not God exists. What you're really harping on is the Gnostic agnostic distinction, because that's knowing whether or not God exists. I don't think anybody knows whether or not God exists. There are plenty, and in fact I would say probably a majority of theists out there would be Gnostic theists who know that God exists for one reason or another. But what you're trying to do is force theism and atheism from a belief position into a knowledge position. And you're really just wrong on this entire thing.
So if we want to compare atheism and theism, which is almost always what is the case, then atheism has to be understood as a belief that the proposition God does not exist is true. This is a major issue for those atheists who want to treat atheism as a mere lack of belief. Because even if we grant that the definition they're using for the word atheism is a mere lack of belief, their actions reveal that they are functionally treating atheism as though it were the opposite of theism.
Because atheism is the opposite of theism. You're trying to force theism into a definition that is simply not the definition of it, because you're trying to change it from a belief to a knowledge claim. That's what you're inherently trying to do. I realize that your definition is believing that a proposition is true. It's almost like you're switching things around, though, because you totally neglect the whole belief part, and you're just focusing on the proposition and whether or not that proposition is absolutely true or not. So I would say that right from the start, with how you understand theism is completely wrong, and you seem to be shuffling up your definition and focusing on the entirely wrong part of the definition.
Which means they are treating atheism as though it is a propositional belief. Let's think about it. Think about these debates with someone like Matt Dillahunty. I know that he considers atheism to be a mere lack of belief, but he frequently engages in counter-apologetics against theists as though atheism is some sort of categorical alternative to theism. But that simply cannot be the case if atheism is a mere lack of belief.
Your entire example here seems to be a non sequitur because it doesn't really follow. I don't have to be putting forth a proposition that God does not exist in order to argue against your particular version of God. I can be putting forth the proposition that your particular God does not exist, which I am Gnostic on that particular issue. I'm Gnostic when it comes to the Christian or the Yahweh version of God. I know that he doesn't exist because he has his own rule book. It's been out there for a while. He doesn't live up to it. Nothing in the Bible seems to map to history, really. There are some very vague portions of it that do map to history, but the magical claims, the fantastical claims, none of those things actually map to history. Some of the historical accounts in the Old Testament don't even match up to history. The New Testament is so jumbled up that it does not match history, but in the only slightest of ways. So I know your particular God does not exist. That is my positive proposition, and I do defend that position by arguing against your supposed claims. And that's exactly what Matt Dillahunty was doing. What Matt was not doing was arguing against the entire idea that a God does exist. Matt just simply doesn't believe a God to exist. If he just lacks that belief, or he has that non-belief in a creator deity or a deity in general, he's not putting forth the positive assertion that that particular deity does not exist. He's just saying, I don't believe in it. These are the reasons why I don't believe in it. And they are responses to your evidence that that God does exist. I feel like this is kind of a remedial lesson on how debates and argumentation works. I don't know. I feel like I shouldn't have to be explaining this kind of shit.
So really, when we look at these popular level atheists who demand a lack of belief definition, the best we sort of have for them is this sort of weird mess of cognitive dissonance where they are demanding that we accept a definition for a word that they themselves fail to live according to.
Wait, who's demanding shit? This entire video is you demanding atheists use your particular philosophical academic definition of atheism. Who's demanding shit from who? I'm not demanding that you use my definition of what atheism is. In fact, I started off this entire thing saying that there were multiple definitions, and I even affirm that your particular definition is one definition of atheism. But then I reaffirmed that understanding what a person does and does not believe is more important than squabbling over the use of words. And I mean, I don't know if Matt demands certain definitions out of people. I mean, I don't think that he does that, but I mean, I haven't asked him. I don't see any atheists out there demanding that you use one definition. I see atheists out there explaining what they don't and do believe. I see them explaining their positions. But the only side that I really see demands coming out on are the ones that want to limit atheism to be the Gnostic atheism or the hard atheism. They are usually the ones that sit there and say, nope, that's not a definition. This is the only definition right here. So again, I ask, who's demanding shit? Because it's definitely not me or anybody else that I've seen use the non-belief definition or the lack of belief definition for atheism. Also, how do you come to the conclusion that we are failing to live up to our particular definition? I mean, what we're failing to live up to is your preconceived notion that the only definition of atheism is the Gnostic or hard atheism. That's the only thing that we're failing to live up to, but that's also not our understanding. So we're not failing to remain consistent in how we label ourselves or anything like that. We're not failing at anything. What I think is failing here is you're failing to understand the multiple definitions that words generally have.
So when it comes to defining atheism, it seems the most appropriate way to go about it is to follow the professional philosophers, the people who do this for a living, and say that atheism is a belief that the proposition God does not exist is true.
But still, you're talking about belief. Somebody believes something. So it's not speaking to the inherent truth value of that something. It's just talking about what the person believes. And all atheism does is speak to what a person doesn't believe. They don't believe a God exists. Now, I will have to say that there is a distinction here that's been brought to my attention recently. The lack of belief definition is kind of non-explicit as to the agency of the thing that you're applying the label to. And that non-belief is a little bit more explicit that you have to have considered the belief in order to have the non-belief in it. Personally, I feel that this nuance is very light, and I can see that particular argument, but just be aware that that is there, that non-belief is a bit more explicit than lack of belief. But essentially, I feel like both of those particular definitions for the label of atheism can be equally applied and are generally interchangeable. So again, I ask, because I'm really confused, and I hope that you answer this, Catalyzing Faith, what would you call somebody that just doesn't believe a God exists?
But why does this matter? Well, when you engage with atheists on the internet, you often run into sort of this indignant response that says you have to treat atheism as a mere lack of belief. And it's important to understand that when someone does this, they're really trying to hide behind this definition that absolves them of any sort of responsibility to give a defense. Because if atheism is a mere lack of belief, then the atheist isn't really making any sort of claim and therefore doesn't have anything to defend.
Atheists are not making a positive claim, generally speaking. Atheists just simply lack a belief or have a non-belief in a god or gods or some kind of supernatural deity. That's it. We're not saying that it definitely doesn't exist or that it can't exist, although there are atheists out there that do make those particular claims. But colloquially speaking, when you're interacting with people on the internet, it's better to understand what they mean by the label that they use. If they say that they're an atheist, find out whether or not it's just a non-belief or if it's a positive belief that no gods exist. I mean, if you're genuinely confused on how people colloquially use the word atheism, then you need to do that in conversations. That's why when I ever get into these kinds of conversations, I make sure to make the distinction that I'm an agnostic atheist, meaning that I don't believe a God to exist, but I also don't know whether or not a God exists. That's the exact proposition that you are putting forth here, but you're mixing up the two things, and then you're only focusing on the knowledge bit. So you're mixing up these two categories of statements. You're crushing them together, and then you're only focusing on the one that works for you. And the one that works for you is a positive assertion that no gods exist. And that's what you're focusing on.
But if atheism is a belief, then the atheist has just as much a burden of proof that they need to uphold as the theist does.
You see, I would agree on this particular position. I think that if I come at you saying that your God doesn't exist, then it kind of is up to me to give you evidence as to why he doesn't exist. But at the same time, I also see it from the other point of view of not believing in your particular deity, and then you needing to provide me with evidence. And then I can explain to you why that evidence doesn't support your conclusion. So that's still not me making a positive assertion. That's you failing to prove that your particular definition of God exists. The only burden that we really shoulder is to explain to you why we don't believe in your God. That's the only burden that we really shoulder. Not to definitively prove that your God doesn't exist or that any God doesn't exist. Just to prove why we don't believe in your particular God.
So the next time someone comes up to you and demands that you treat atheism as a mere lack of belief, be sure to remind them that if that's the way they want to go, then atheism and theism don't even belong in the same conversation because they're not the same type of thing.
Well, no, you're just simply wrong on this last part, because they definitely are the same type of thing. Because theism is a belief in a God or gods, and atheism is just simply not a belief in God or gods. So they're literally the same thing, just one is the antithesis of the other. What this guy, Catalyzing Faith, is trying to do in his video here, he's trying to take the knowledge category and mash it up with the belief category as if they are the same thing. But then when he analyzes those propositions, he only focuses on the knowledge part. So that means that atheism is making the positive claim that God does not exist, or that the positive claim that no gods exist. What you're doing ultimately is an equivocation fallacy, because you're mixing up these two different things that are somewhat similar, and you're misrepresenting them in order to argue for your particular position. And inherently, I love the hypocrisy in the video, because you're complaining about atheists demanding certain definitions, while at the same time, you are demanding a certain definition for atheists to use for their own non-belief. It's really kind of a mindfuck if you think about it. But in any case, I really appreciate your video there, Catalyzing Faith. I love how you structured it and everything like that. I enjoy a good conversation over these particular topics. I did ultimately want to know what you would call somebody that just simply doesn't believe in your particular God, or doesn't believe in a God at all. I would love to know what label you would use for that, because after this video, I have no idea what you would call that person, if not atheist. As for all of you out there, go down there into the comments. Let me know what you thought about this video. I'd really love to hear it. Whether you disagree with me, disagree with Catalyzing Faith, let me know down below. While you're down there, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of video. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice, regardless of which position you take. Bye, heathens.